I always tell people that basements are the closest thing most of us will ever have to a personal underworld, a place where the air feels heavier, where light bends differently, where silence seems to breathe. You can walk through your living room 1,000 times without thinking twice. But the moment you stand at the top of the stairs leading down into a basement, something instinctive inside you hesitates. Maybe it's the darkness pooling at the bottom. Maybe it's the fact that basements are built below the earth, resting in layers of soil no sunlight ever touches. Or maybe it's because deep down, we all know basements were never designed for people. They were designed for storage, for forgotten things, for whatever prefers to wait in quiet places. These stories come from ordinary people who experienced something they can't forget. And each one begins with the same idea. They were just doing something normal. And then everything changed. The first story comes from a man who thought he'd only be gone a moment. He had gone downstairs to grab an old space heater for the guest room, a routine task he'd done countless times. But that night, the basement greeted him with an atmosphere he couldn't explain. It felt thick, as if the room had been holding its breath since the last time he'd visited. He stepped down the stairs, gripping the railing a bit more tightly than usual, and told himself it was just the cold air settling. He spotted the heater immediately, sitting right where it always had. But as he picked it up, he heard something shift behind him. A scraping sound, low and slow, like a shoe dragging across concrete. He spun around, expecting to see something that wasn't supposed to be there, but saw nothing. The room was still, the shadows were still, and the silence was absolute. He tried to shake it off, muttering about old houses and weird acoustics. But as he reached the bottom step to go back up, he heard it again. Closer this time, a dragging shuffle, accompanied by a faint exhale. He didn't wait to figure out what it was. He rushed up the stairs, slammed the door behind him, and when he finally found the courage to open it again the next morning, the only thing on the basement floor was a long smear of dust leading across the room to the space where he had been standing. Another story comes from a woman who moved into a century-old farmhouse with her husband. The house was charming on the surface, but the basement was a different world entirely. They noticed early on that their dog refused to go near the basement door. He would whine softly whenever they walked past it, pressing his body against their legs as if urging them to keep moving. One evening, when her husband was working late, she decided to do laundry. She carried the basket down the old wooden stairs, each step creaking under her weight. When she reached the bottom, the pull chain light flickered once before settling into a dim yellow glow. She started loading clothes into the washer, humming to herself to fill the silence. Then she heard whispering, faint, like someone speaking through a wall. She froze, listening closely. The whispering stopped. She told herself she was imagining things. But as she turned back to the washer, she noticed something unsettling. The pull chain, for the light was slowly swaying back and forth, as if someone had brushed past it just moments earlier. She stood there, watching it move in gentle arcs, feeling the basement air grow colder against her skin. She backed up the stairs immediately, laundry forgotten, and refused to enter the basement alone ever again. A third story comes from a college student who rented a basement room to save money. The room itself wasn't terrible, plain, quiet, dim, but livable. Or so he thought. On his second night in the room, he woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps overhead. At first, he assumed his roommates were still awake. But the footsteps were too slow, too deliberate, and they moved in a pattern that didn't match the layout of the house. They circled, stepped, paused, stepped again. It went on for nearly 10 minutes. And just as he started to relax, believing he'd eventually drift back to sleep, he heard something far worse. Footsteps in the basement itself. This time behind his door. Light, careful, almost thoughtful steps moving along the concrete floor. He held his breath as the footsteps approached the door. Then something pressed against it. The door bowed inward with a soft thud, like someone was leaning their forehead against it, listening. He stared at the doorknob, praying it wouldn't turn. After a long moment, the pressure lifted, the footsteps retreated, and the room went quiet. When he checked the hallway the next morning, he found a small pile of dirt right in front of his door, as if someone or something had been standing there for a long, long time. Basements hide things we would prefer not to think about. Forgotten rooms, old pipes, peeling foundation walls, objects left behind by previous owners. But sometimes, basements hide things that don't belong to any house or any history we know of. Things that show up without explanation, linger without purpose, and vanish without ever being caught. Perhaps that's why the fear feels so real. It isn't always about what you see. It's about what you didn't see, but felt. It's about that one moment you hesitate at the top of the stairs, because something in your instincts tells you the darkness below is not entirely empty. The stories people share make it clear that the boundary between normal and terrifying is thinner in basements than anywhere else in the home. And when something in the shadows decides to acknowledge you, even for a moment, that moment never leaves you. The third story came from a man who never liked basements to begin with. Not because of ghosts, not because of childhood traumas, just because he hated enclosed spaces. But after what he saw one particular night, he said he will never in his life step into another basement again, even if his house were on fire. He worked night shifts at a small-town grocery store, the kind that still kept giant freezers and old storage rooms in the basement. That night, the store was supposed to be empty. Every employee had gone home. He clocked out, gathered his things, and was heading toward the exit when he realized he had forgotten his lunch container in the downstairs break room. Annoyed and wanting to avoid hearing jokes from his co-workers the next day, he reluctantly went back down. The basement of that store was strange. Too cold, too quiet, with long fluorescent bulbs that flickered at random intervals. He always felt like the air was heavier down there, as if the whole basement was slightly underwater. The moment he opened the stairwell door, something felt wrong. The lights were dimmer than usual. The buzzing sound from the old bulbs was louder, harsher. Still, he pushed himself to go down the narrow steps, repeating over and over that he'd be out in under a minute. When he reached the bottom, he froze. The break room light was already on. He knew for a fact that he had turned it off before going upstairs. He always did. It was a habit drilled into him because the manager would complain about wasted energy. But the light was glowing bright and steady, almost unnaturally steady. No flickering like the hallway lights, like something had just switched it on moments before. He stepped forward slowly, his heartbeat loud enough that he could hear it over the hum of the fluorescence. "Hello?" he called out, even though he knew no one should be there. The only answer was the low rumble of the freezer room down the hall. He inched toward the break room door and nudged it open with the tips of his fingers. His lunchbox sat on the table. That wasn't the problem. What terrified him, what made him stop breathing for several seconds, was the figure sitting in the chair beside it. A man, shoulders hunched forward, head tilted strangely, like his neck had been bent too far to one side. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just sat there, facing the table, hands resting flat on the surface, like something had carefully positioned them there. The employee stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the floor. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't listen. He finally blurted out, "Sir, are you okay?" But the figure didn't even twitch. For a second, he thought it was maybe a mannequin. But the store didn't keep mannequins. And even if they did, why would someone drag one into the basement break room and place it at a table? He gathered whatever courage he had left and took one slow step into the room. The fluorescent light hummed softly, illuminating the figure's dark clothing, tangled hair, and pale hands. Then the breath caught in his throat. The head wasn't attached the right way. The figure's jaw faced the opposite direction of its body, like its head had been rotated almost 180 degrees. Suddenly, with a dry cracking sound, the figure began to lift its head, not in a smooth, natural movement, but like something learning how to lift its neck for the first time. The head jerked upward, the chin scraping slightly against the shoulder. He saw the face now, grayish, sunken, the skin stretched wrong, like it had been repositioned. The eyes were not focused. They were cloudy, unfocused, yet somehow aware. The man bolted out of the room. The figure didn't get up, didn't chase him, didn't speak. It just watched him flee. He sprinted up the stairs, didn't bother turning off the lights, didn't lock the door. He sped home and didn't return to work for 3 days. When he finally told the manager what had happened, he expected to be laughed at. Instead, the manager's face went pale. Then he quietly said, You saw it too. It turns out 3 night shift workers before him had quit after similar encounters. Seeing a figure sitting motionless in the break room, or glimpsing a head turned the wrong way down one of the aisles. None of them stayed long enough to let it do anything. Next came a story from a young woman who thought her basement was the safest place in the world. She turned it into a cozy living space, complete with soft lamps, thick rugs, and shelves of her favorite books. It was her sanctuary. But she learned something important. Just because a space feels warm and safe doesn't mean it is. She used to hear tapping noises in the walls late at night. At first, she assumed they were from the house settling or maybe mice. But the tapping always came in patterns, rhythmic, intentional, like someone knocking in a slow, steady sequence. One night she had a friend over, and as they talked on the couch, that familiar tapping started again. Her friend paused and asked, "Do you have a roommate downstairs?" She shook her head. "It's an old house," she said. "Pipes make weird noises." But her friend wasn't convinced. The tapping grew louder, moving from the far corner of the basement to just behind the wall they were leaning against. Then the basement lights flickered. Her friend suggested they leave. She brushed it off, embarrassed, not wanting to seem paranoid. But the tapping changed. Instead of the slow pattern she was used to, it became frantic, like someone pounding both fists against the inside of the wall, desperate to break out. They both jumped to their feet. And then, something neither of them could explain happened. The books on her shelves began to slide forward one by one, as if pushed from behind. Not falling randomly, each one moved slowly, deliberately, until they dropped onto the floor in a straight line. Her friend whispered, "We're leaving now." They rushed upstairs, locked the basement door, and sat together in silence, listening to the pounding continuing below them. Over the next week, she slept upstairs. She didn't go near the basement until she invited a contractor to open the wall. When he did, the smell hit them first. And then he found it. A small sealed-off crawl space behind the wall, containing old clothing, an iron bed frame, and deep scratches in the wooden boards. Long, frantic gouges made by human hands. She moved out a month later. And that brings us to another basement story, one that multiple people have reported over the years. The next story came from a man who rented an old farmhouse in the countryside. One of those quiet, lonely properties where the nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. The basement of the house was made of old stone walls, uneven floors, and wooden beams that creaked whenever the weather changed. He didn't use it often, except for storing tools and firewood. But after one terrifying winter storm, the basement became the center of something he still refuses to fully talk about. One night, a brutal windstorm hit. So loud it rattled every window in the house. The trees outside bent so far that he expected one to break through his living room wall. When the power finally went out, he grabbed a flashlight and decided to head to the basement to check the circuit box. The flashlight flickered every few seconds. and the cold air made the skin on his arms prickle. The basement door always creaked, but that night the sound felt different. Slower, longer, as if something heavy were dragging its weight along the wood. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air blew upward, not from ventilation, but from a source much deeper below. He walked carefully down the stairs. To this day, he swears he wasn't alone. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Damp, stale, but also strangely metallic, like old rust or dried blood. He scanned the basement with his light, passing over his tools, the pile of wood, the stone walls, until the beam landed on the far corner. For a moment, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Something seemed wrong, like the shadows were layered too thickly, as if something large was crouched there, blending into the darkness. He said, "If someone's down here, you need to leave. I'm armed." It wasn't true, but fear makes you say things. The shadow didn't move. He took a step forward, heartbeat pounding. And then the crouched shape, whatever it was, slowly, painfully stood up, not with the smooth, natural motion of a person, but with twitching, jerking movements, like joints bending in the wrong directions. The shape stretched taller and taller, rising until its head nearly brushed the basement ceiling. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. The thing started to tilt its head as if examining him. The flashlight flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, he heard it take a single shuffling step toward him. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. He backed up until he hit the stairs. He raised the light again, and the shape had gotten closer, far too close for the little time that had passed. Then, right as he was about to run, the storm caused the entire house to shake violently. The basement groaned, dust falling from the rafters. The light flickered, and for a fraction of a second, he saw its face. Pale, elongated, and twisted in a way no living human's face could ever be. He bolted up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it. The pounding that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes. Slow, rhythmic knocks against the other side of the basement door. Not angry, not chaotic, like it was waiting for him. The storm ended the next morning, and so did the knocking. When he finally got the courage to check the basement days later, the corner where the figure had stood was empty, except for a long drag mark across the dusty floor, as if something had moved from one side of the room to the other. He broke the lease 2 weeks later. Next is a story from a college student who moved into a cheap rental house with friends. The house was old and cramped, but the rent was affordable. The basement wasn't finished, just concrete, some wooden beams, and a few pipes sticking out of the ceiling. But they used it to store boxes and old furniture. After a few months, strange things started happening. It began with footsteps, not from upstairs. Those they could explain. These were coming from below. Heavy steps, slow steps, sometimes moving from one side of the basement to the other, sometimes pacing back and forth directly beneath their living room floor. They'd look at each other during movie nights and ask, "Did you hear that?" The answer was always yes. One night, around 2 a.m., they heard something new. A dragging noise, like someone pulling a heavy object across concrete. They woke each other up and stood at the top of the basement stairs listening. None of them wanted to go down, but curiosity won. The three of them armed themselves with flashlights and baseball bats and descended the stairs together. The air was freezing, not cold like a basement, but cold like the inside of a freezer. They saw their breath, and then they saw the boxes. They had all been rearranged into a perfect circle in the center of the room, not thrown around, not pushed randomly, arranged intentionally. One of the roommates whispered, "This is not a joke anymore." Then they heard it, a low, drawn-out exhale coming from behind the boiler. One of the guys shouted, "Who's there?" But the only answer was the hum of the furnace. They thought maybe an animal had gotten inside. But the breathing wasn't sporadic or panicked. It was steady, like a person trying to control their breath. When one roommate mustered the courage to walk around the boiler, he screamed and ran toward the stairs. The others followed instinctively, not daring to look behind them. Hours later, he finally explained what he had seen. A man. Not a ghost, not a shadow. A real man crouched in the dark, naked, his skin filthy, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he had been living there for months. The police searched the basement extensively, found signs of habitation, bedding made of old clothes, bits of food wrappers, scratches in the concrete. But the man was gone. They moved out within the week. And now, a different kind of basement story. One that begins quietly, almost innocently, and becomes something far worse. A young couple bought their first home. A small 2-story property with a half-finished basement. They decided to convert it into a small office and recreation space. But within days of starting the renovation, they began noticing odd disturbances. Tools would go missing. Paint cans would be moved. And at night, they'd hear sounds. Soft shuffling noises, like someone's bare feet brushing against the floor. They assumed it was the house settling. But then, the wife started waking up at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. Not 3:16, not 3:18, always 3:17. She would jolt awake with the overwhelming sense that someone was standing near the basement door. But every time she checked, nothing was there. The husband dismissed it as stress. Until one night, he saw the basement lights turn on by themselves. I eased back into the rhythm of the night, letting the gentle hum of the unseen seep into the edges of the story, as if the basement itself wanted to finish what the others had started. This fourth descent begins with a memory sent by a man who swore he was never frightened of anything. Not storms, not darkness, not the creaks of old houses. But even he admitted that whatever lived beneath his childhood home had changed him forever. He said the first time he heard it, he thought it was a raccoon trapped in the crawl space, a faint scraping noise that came and went with the hours. But every time he went down to check, the noise went dead silent, leaving him standing there with nothing but the low hum of the furnace rattling beside him. A week passed before he realized the pattern. The noise didn't stop when he entered the basement. It stopped when he reached the final step, as if something down there knew exactly when he arrived. One night, fed up and exhausted, he marched down those steps with a flashlight and a baseball bat. He swept the beam across the concrete floor, checked behind the water heater, even crawled halfway into the crawl space. Nothing. But as he backed out, he felt fingers wrap around his ankle. He jerked instinctively, kicking hard, scrambling backward until he hit the support post. The beam of his flashlight swung wildly, catching only dust and cobwebs. He scrambled up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and held it shut with his shoulder. He said he expected pounding, yelling, something. But the basement stayed perfectly silent. He kept the door locked every night after that, until the family eventually moved. And even years later, if he hears a scrape along a concrete floor, his blood runs cold. The next story comes from a woman who moved into a duplex that had been converted from an old farmhouse. Her section of the basement was unfinished, carved into rough stone walls and wooden support beams that looked ready to crumble. She said she only went down there for laundry. But even then, she felt watched. She described it as an invisible weight pressing against the back of her skull, urging her to finish quickly. One night, she carried a basket of clothes down the narrow staircase and paused halfway because she heard breathing, not the house settling, not the hum of the dryer, steady, human-like inhaling and exhaling coming from behind the furnace. She froze, listening, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. She set the laundry basket down slowly, each movement deliberate, trying not to make a sound. But with her next step, the old stair creaked, and the breathing instantly changed, faster, louder, as if whatever was there had been startled. She didn't look behind her. She sprinted up the stairs, leaving the basket behind. The next morning, she found it sitting neatly at the top of the stairs, folded clothes and all. She moved out within the week. Another listener submitted a story that still gives me chills because it wasn't the basement itself that was terrifying. It was what followed him from it. He grew up in a house where the basement light switch was at the bottom of the stairs instead of the top, which meant each trip required a blind walk into total blackness. He'd grown used to it until one evening when he reached the bottom and felt a presence directly behind him. Not warm, not cold, just wrong, like standing in front of an open elevator shaft. He flicked on the light and spun around, expecting to see his brother messing with him. But the stairs were empty. He went about his business, but before he left, he felt something brush past him, as light as a spider web drifting across his arm. He turned the switch off and rushed up the stairs. But halfway up, he heard footsteps behind him, climbing each step in perfect sync with his own. He reached the top, slammed the door, and braced himself. The footsteps stopped. But from that night on, every time he walked through the house, he heard the faint sound of someone trailing just behind him, always a fraction of a second too late, always stopping when he did. He had the house blessed twice before the presence finally faded. The final story of this section comes from a man whose basement held a strange architectural feature. A narrow doorway sealed with bricks that didn't match the rest of the foundation. It stood in the far corner, mortar crumbling, bricks uneven as if hastily placed. He never questioned it until the day he heard a faint knocking coming from behind it. At first, he thought it was the pipes expanding. But the knocks came again. 3 times. Deliberate. Measured. He pressed his ear to the cold brick and felt a faint vibration, as though something moved just inches beyond the wall. He backed away quickly, heart hammering. But the knocks followed, softer now, almost hesitant. That night, he dreamed of the basement, of hands pushing from the other side of the sealed doorway, leaving white smears along the brickwork. The next morning, he checked. No smears, but the dust on the floor had shifted into a pattern that looked disturbingly like handprints reaching outward. He said he wanted to run, but curiosity rooted him where he stood. The knocking faded into a slow dragging sound, like fingertips slipping across stone. He stepped back in alarm and noticed dust shifting outward between the bricks, drifting toward him in thin, deliberate pulses. It was enough to shatter any sense of bravery he had left. He fled the basement, leaving the lights on behind him, feeling the weight of something unseen trailing at his heels. That night, he slept with a chair propped under the doorknob, convinced that the sealed doorway below held more than just old stone and forgotten space. Convinced that whatever lived behind those mismatched bricks had been waiting for someone, anyone, to hear it. And he feared it would not stop calling until someone finally answered in the dark. He always thought basements were just places to store old furniture, boxes, and the kind of junk you couldn't part with yet. But after what happened in his childhood home, he realized that even the most ordinary basements could hide extraordinary terror. He had moved back to his parents' house for the summer, a small town home with an unfinished basement that smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. His siblings had warned him about it, joking about the monster under the stairs. But he had laughed it off. That is, until the first night he stayed down there alone. He was sitting on the basement steps, scrolling through his phone, when he heard the faintest whisper. It was so subtle, he almost ignored it, thinking one of his siblings was trying to scare him. The whisper grew slightly louder. It wasn't words at first, just a hissing, sighing sound, like the house itself was breathing. Then, unmistakably, it said his name. Michael. A single syllable, drawn out and soft, but unmistakably his own name. He froze, gripping his phone like a lifeline. His mind raced. It had to be a sibling. But all of them were upstairs, asleep. His parents' bedroom door was closed. He told himself to breathe, to ignore it, to leave. But as he slowly rose to take a step up the basement stairs, a shadow moved behind the furnace. Not a fleeting movement, a definite, deliberate presence, shifting as if observing him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. Instead, he froze, staring at the shadow, trying to convince himself that light and logic could explain it. It stepped closer. He didn't see a face, just a shape, tall and dark, moving with purpose. He tried to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. The whisper came again, this time from multiple directions, as if several entities had crowded the basement at once. "Michael! Michael!" The sound rose in volume and intensity. Heart racing, he forced himself to climb the stairs, never turning around. By the time he reached the top, his hands were shaking violently. He locked the basement door behind him and didn't look back for the rest of the night. The next morning, he went down with his father to investigate. Everything seemed normal. The furnace was where it had always been. The boxes and stored furniture hadn't moved. Yet, he noticed something that made his stomach turn. A single, muddy footprint leading from the furnace to the basement door. Only one, impossibly small, impossibly fresh. He asked his father, who brushed it off as dirt from the yard. But Michael knew it hadn't been there the night before. He never returned to that basement alone. Another story comes from a couple who bought a historic home that had stood empty for decades. The basement was partially finished and mostly used for storage. At first, everything seemed normal. That is, until the first night they slept there. Around midnight, the husband heard the basement door creak open. At first, he thought his wife had gotten up. But then he heard heavy breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from the stairs. He crept out of bed, flashlight in hand, and peered down. The basement was empty, or at least it looked empty. The shadow at the far corner moved again, just slightly, as though it were shifting on the edge of vision. Terrified, he descended, flashlight trembling in his hands. He checked every corner, every box, every darkened space. Nothing. But when he returned upstairs, he noticed something chilling. The basement light, which they had always left off, was now on. Not flickering, not dim, bright. As if someone or something had flipped the switch. Over the following nights, they experienced more. Whispers from the stairwell, cold air that seemed to follow them into the basement, objects being moved just slightly out of place. Every investigation yielded nothing concrete, but the terror was very real. And one morning, when they finally pried open a storage trunk they had ignored for months, they found a series of crude drawings on the inside lid, figures that looked impossibly human. yet stretched and elongated, etched deep into the wood, as if the person or entity had used nails instead of pencils. The couple sold the house 6 months later. Next, we moved to a man who lived alone in an apartment with a small dark basement used for laundry. He said he was practical and unafraid of shadows. But one night, as he lowered his laundry basket down the narrow concrete steps, he felt it. The weight. The undeniable pressure of someone or something watching him. He paused, scanning the dim corners with the flashlight. Nothing. Then the sound came, a soft scrape, like nails dragging across concrete. Not behind him, not in front, all around. It echoed in the low ceilinged space, making his skin crawl. He dropped the basket and ran up the stairs, locking the door. The next day, he found the basket had been emptied, clothes folded neatly inside, but not by human hands. There were no fingerprints, no marks of any kind, just folded perfectly. He never went down again after sunset. Another terrifying basement encounter involves a family that discovered a hidden door behind old shelves. The basement was their usual storage space. But when they shifted some boxes, they found a narrow opening in the wall. The door was old, warped, and difficult to open. Against better judgment, they forced it open and found a narrow crawl space, dust-laden and filled with odd, decayed furniture. Inside were small personal items, a child's toy, an old diary, scraps of paper. Nothing that seemed alarming at first, until they noticed the walls. Faint scratches, irregular, deep, and deliberate. Not accidental, not animal, human, though no one had lived there for decades. At night, they heard whispers echoing from that crawl space. No words, just voices. Slow, patient, waiting. The family sealed the door with cement after a week. And still, some nights, the whispers returned. Quiet, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere below the concrete floor. They moved out the next year. A young woman sent in a story about a shared basement in an apartment building. Tenants rarely went down there except to access storage lockers. She said that for the first month, nothing happened. Then, late one evening, she had to retrieve some boxes. The basement was dark, only the dim emergency lights casting a pale glow on concrete walls. As she walked, she felt a sudden cold draft brush past her. She glanced around, but the air was still. Then she heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping, following her as she moved through the aisles. The tapping accelerated when she paused, almost urgent, almost impatient. She ran back to the stairs, turning just in time to see a dark, featureless shape sliding across the floor behind her. It stopped as she reached the stairwell, melted back into the shadows. She never returned alone. Finally, one last story for this additional section. A man inherited his grandfather's old home. The basement was filled with decades of old tools, furniture, and the remnants of forgotten lives. One evening, he descended to look for an old toolbox. As he passed a pile of crates, he heard a whisper, soft, urgent, almost like a warning. He froze, listening. The voice grew louder. "Do not touch." He brushed it off as imagination. But then he felt a hand grip his wrist. He yanked it back, scanning the room. No one was there. The crates, however, had shifted slightly, forming a line that pointed directly at the far wall. On that wall, scratched deep into the plaster, were numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, stretching along the wall like a countdown. He left immediately, not returning for months. When he finally investigated, the numbers were gone. The wall smooth, as if never tampered with. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Basements are, in many ways, the perfect canvas for fear. They are private, isolated, and dark. They hold the echoes of the past, objects abandoned, secrets buried. And, as these stories show, they also hold what we cannot explain. Something unseen, patient, sometimes playful, often terrifying. Something that waits for just the right moment, the exact point of vulnerability, to make its presence known. Perhaps that is why, even when these basements are empty or seemingly mundane, the memory of them lingers, long after the lights are turned off, long after the doors are locked.